some people have said, well, because you claim there's systemic issues with some of the hadith that have been transmitted, um, why can't you say that about the Quran? Now, and I've been sent a few different videos by different people saying this, by the way. So I was sent a video by a scholar who usually, I mean, I find his stuff usually quite amusing and good. I believe his name is Maulana, or it may be Mufti Manzoor Mengal from Pakistan, where he's got a clip where he's speaking about, where he says, Ruwatul Hadithi, hum Ruwatul Quran. Where he says that the people who transmitted the hadith are the people who transmitted the Quran. So if you are going to weaken hadith, then thereby you have weakened Quran. This is the argument. Somebody sent me a clip by Dawah Man saying the same thing, which really, that Dawah Man is not a scholar, so that's not even relevant, but it's the same argument. And we've heard quite a few other scholars saying this. I've heard a few scholars saying this. Now, so I want to address this point. You see, anybody who says this, people, first of all, there's a few important points to make. One is that these people have not truly understood how the Quran was transmitted. Okay, these people who are saying this, they have just been institutionalized. And they don't realize, they haven't deeply actually fathomed how the Quran and how Islam and its tradition was transmitted. And I will go through that in just a moment. Secondly, I feel that it's such a shame that these people feel that they can strong arm somebody who questions the authenticity of certain hadith based on sound reason by throwing the Quran under the bus. That I find that to be such an act of cowardice, that where you could not substantiate those particular hadith that are being questioned, or you are being presented by a narrative of realism, that look, your only response is to throw the entire Quran under the bus in an attempt to save Bukhari. I mean, that is the most, I find, despicable and cowardly act done by Muslim scholars who truly lack an understanding of how this tradition was transmitted. Okay, so I'd like to clarify, I'd like to expand. Allow me to elucidate. Expand. Elucidate. See, if I don't use these words, people say, yaar, ye mufti kuch padhta hi nahi. People will accuse me of not even being educated. So one must resort to an expansive reply. So, right, so, okay, so let's take a look at how was the Quran transmitted? How was the Quran transmitted? So people, Islam, when the Prophet lived amongst people and the companions after him, there was a living tradition of Islam. If we can call that a living tradition, okay, living tradition is what people will just teach. Parents will teach their children. It will just become a kind of folk practice. It will just permeate through communities and societies. It is part and parcel of the living tradition. Now, the Quran was transmitted en masse. Like people, you know, they just taught it. They taught it to their children. They taught it to their neighbors. They taught it to their friends. People conveyed the message of the Quran before the arrival or advent of institutionalization. So as a deen of fitrah, the Quran was being transmitted. So if I knew the Quran, I would read it in my salah, I would read the Quran in my daily prayers, I would teach it to my children, I might sometimes have a discussion on it. This was just the natural living practice that people were passing on the Quran, one could say from father to child. Okay, there was not an institutionalization to it. It was just a natural tradition. The other thing is, and this is something nobody would really deny, that Muslims were doing this. I mean, even non-Muslim historians, they acknowledge that yes, Muslims, they had this scripture. They had this thing called the Quran. Secondly, the Quran by its nature, ontologically, by its essence, okay, is a Quran. It's a recitation. It's a recital of something. It's not prose. It's not something like, here's a book, right? It's not a book like you just read, like I'm just reading this book. It was a recitation, which meant it had a rhythmic essence to it. So people would recite, and we know that the Quran was preserved by memory. So people would recite the Quran, they would read it in their salah, they would read it during Ramadan, in Taraweeh. It was being conveyed, it was just being taught. And this is how it permeates through the communities. It was just part and parcel of the living tradition of Islam. Now we have to pause that there. Pause it, people, pause it. Now we're going to come to this question of people who corrupt a message. Right, so when people decide to interpolate, when people decide to add, to fabricate, to manufacture a message, there may be many motivations behind this, many motivations. Amongst them, for example, they could be good, they could be beneficent, believe it or not. They could be kind of like kind-hearted motivation. So people think, I know, I'm going to invent a teaching. I think more Muslims should do Hajj, for example. So I'm going to invent something about the benefits for Hajj. And believe it or not, people have done this. It's like some of them used to say that we don't fabricate against the Prophet, we fabricate for the Prophet. لا نكذب عليه نكذب له. We don't lie against him, we lie for him. Yeah, 1 2 ka 4. This one not nice, my friend. So this is what some people were doing, right? So there's many reasons why people fabricate things. They bring things in. It could be that there's misunderstandings. They could be false memories. So these are all kind or benevolent kind of non-harmful. I mean, I don't know if that's the right word, but let's say if we call them, kind-hearted kind of manufacturing of Islamic teachings. It could be because people have got a good intention. It could be because it's a false memory. A person actually thinks, oh yeah, wasn't this also part of the teaching? And he gets it wrong. That could be. Then there could be negative, like malignant kind of intentions, bad intentions, where people they want to corrupt a faith. They want to kind of mess it up for people. Or they want people, so that could be one reason, they want to corrupt the faith. They want to, or that they have a personal vested interest. So somebody wants to, they sell vegetables to buy their vegetables. So they start saying, do you know that Islam encourages eating vegetables? Now that's, believe it or not, actually happened as well. You had somebody who fabricated a hadith to do with Badinjan. Badinjan is what we call in Urdu Bengan. apologize for the disconnect there, we're back. So there were people who invented hadith to say that, who invented teachings to say anybody who eats the aubergine plant will have such and such a reward. You know, the bingen. The merits of the bingen. But this is, so sometimes there's a vested interest, sometimes there's political interests. So people sectarian. So there's a lot of teachings that were fabricated to create an uprising against the state, against the Umayyad dynasty, for example, which a lot of the Shia people did. And hence they really pushed the whole messianic vision that there will be a Messiah that will come and a Mahdi will come and all these things. And then there were a lot of teachings fabricated to consolidate the state. So the Umayyad dynasty came up with a lot of rulings that would help them. Like when they wanted to take over India, it's very convenient that all of a sudden there's a hadith that the Prophet said, oh, the great battle of India. So these things were just teachings of convenience. So there's a lot of reasons why people fabricate something. So now this is important that we clarify that. Now let's just pause that for a moment. Let's come back to the working board here, people. What is the problem, I ask you, what is the problem, or the challenge is a better word, with trying to push your false teachings into the Quran? What do you think would be the problem? If you were a person, pretend you are a person who is intentionally, because if we take the worst case scenario first, we can deal with the other cases by extension easily. So those people who are intentionally premeditating an attempt to corrupt the faith, they want to mess up the teachings of Islam. What would be your challenges if you were trying to add verses into the Quran? You know very well that would not fly. It would be so difficult. Why? Number of reasons. One, the Quran is so widespread. People are reciting it all the time. So if I wanted to, I don't know, say, add a ruling into the Quran, I have to match the entire context of the Quran. So let's say I wanted to invent some hadith to support the state of Bani Umayyah, the Umayyad dynasty. Now, I can't just add a verse of the Quran saying, hey, and there will be a great dynasty called Bani Umayyah. Because the Quran, it's not its style to speak like that. So this becomes very difficult. The other thing is the Quran does not often delve into tiny issues. It seems to have a very universal approach. It's speaking about things universally. And fabricating a universal is very meaningless. Like, you know, if I want to fabricate a universal ruling. The problem is so many people read the Quran in different parts of the world. All these people read it. It's part and parcel of the tradition. I have to then make sure this thing matches the exact style. It matches the context. It doesn't go against the overall message of the Quran. So some people did try this with the satanic verses. And it flopped. Why did it flop? Because it clashed with the overall message, and people spotted it as a contradiction. And so the return on investment here is very little. It's not worth trying to corrupt the Quran in that, you know, with that in mind, because you're not going to get much back out of it. Okay. This, however, is not the same with hadith. The hadith don't have a context. The hadith were not being taught from father to child. They were not part of this living tradition, unless, you know, maybe a one-off story may have been, but hadith weren't. Hadith start to get documented almost 100 years after the Prophet. By that time, many false hadith are in circulation. For me to make up a hadith, all I have to say is, the Prophet said, whosoever doesn't watch Monday Nights with Mufti has lost out on a great big fortune, for example. That's it. Trying to add that in the Quran is impossible. Next to impossible. Why? Because one, the Quran doesn't talk about things like this in general, so people will spot it. Two, I have to match the rhythm, the nazm, the flow of the Quran. I have to choose a particular surah to add it into. Then people are all reciting that surah in different parts of the world. It wouldn't really fly. So this is why people did not corrupt the Quran in that way. It wasn't a project that they could see a return on investment in. So when people say, but if you problematize hadith, then you by default problematize the Quran. No, you don't at all. The Quran was never transmitted through a sole transmitter. It was just taught en masse. That's it. Now, yes, when the hadith culture takes off, the hadith project becomes so powerful that it pours into many other aspects of Muslim tradition. So the way in hadith you have a chain. So this chain and everything started to get documented over 100 years after the Prophet. So when hadith were first documented in the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, the chains weren't being documented. But then within a decade or two after him, people started to document the chains. And then they started to say, well, that person, we're not so sure if he's reliable, or that person and that person. And they did a great job of trying to scrutinize the chains. But it's not infallible. Okay, so it's still susceptible to error. It's prone to error. It still does have some mistakes. That's why whenever a hadith clashes with the Quran or clashes with the principles of Islam, we abandon that hadith, because there's no way it could have clashed with this. Now, later on, this hadith project becomes so fashionable that people start to have chains in everything. You see, it becomes the thing. It's not like, it's like I give you an example. You know, Snapchat, for example, had stories which were so, the stories that you have, the 24-hour stories, which are still there, became so fashionable that all other social media outlets started to adopt stories. You know, your Facebook Messenger has a story, Instagram has a story, bloody everything. You know, Microsoft Excel would probably have a story. So everybody just takes up something that starts to really take off. Now, in a similar way, once the Hadith project became a dominating project, which it did, you see everybody, even if you're learning Arabic grammar, which has got nothing, think about it, what has Arabic grammar got to do with the chain of transmission? But all of a sudden, they too now have chains of transmission. Oh, I took this from my teacher, who took it from Farra, who took it from Kasai, who took it from... I mean, it's nothing to do with, you know, who cares, it's grammar. But no, we're going to have a chain of transmission in it. Oh, where did you learn this from? I learned it from here. Where did you learn this poetry from? I took it from him, who took it from him, who took it from this Imam Shafi'i's poem. So this chain of transmission, isnad, just as a superfluous event, not as something carrying actual meaning, as a trend, it trickles into all other sciences, which were just normal teaching, normal thing, and some were part of the living tradition. So fiqh, for example, people say, well, if you don't have hadith, how do you know how to pray? Because it was part of the living tradition. See, the living tradition predates the documentation of fiqh. It was just what the parents taught their children. And it was part and parcel of the Muslim community. So this fiqh now, all of a sudden, people start to have a chain in it. Oh, where did you get it from? I got it from him, who got it from him. Oh, wow, I like this chain. Don't get me, and don't get it, I don't want you to misunderstand me. I like this as a kind of, as a decor, something decorative of our legacy. I like it too. I obtained recently, in the last few years, a chain of transmission in fiqh. Even though fiqh is really, the chain doesn't mean really anything, but it's nice, it's a collector's item to people who are part and parcel of this tradition. So what started to happen is the Quran too, people started to transmit in chains. You got it from this guy, okay, I'm going to take his name, I'm going to take his name. So some people naively thought that because the Quran has a chain as well now, oh, so it must have been taught only through chains, the way Hadith was taught. That is a mistake on their part. That's like saying because Arabic grammar had a chain, so everybody who ever knew Arabic grammar knew it because he must have studied it all through this one guy who taught it through a chain. That's ridiculous. So I hope that sheds some clarity on this kind of fallacy that the way Hadith was transmitted is how the Quran was transmitted. It was not. The Quran was transmitted as part of the living tradition, was transmitted en masse. Hadith was transmitted as an institution. So people sat down and taught it. Okay. So cool. So I hope that explains that. I did feel that that was very important to kind of cover.